Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in the Blue Ridge Mountains history. Before we start, please tell me where you're watching from and what time it is when you listen to this narration in the comments. We want to know where these written accounts go and when they get there. The Wynn Inn, a weathered building that used to stand in the shadow of the ancient Blue Ridge Mountains, was a symbol of hospitality. It was built in 1878 on a steep hill that looked down on the town of Blacksburg, Virginia. Visitors who were passing through might have thought of it as just another place to sleep, but locals knew better than to tell visitors they liked about it. The three-story Victorian edifice, with its imposing gables and wraparound porch, had earned a peculiar reputation among those who lived in its vicinity. It wasn't because of any one thing that happened, but because of the constant feeling of unease that seemed to come from behind its lace curtains and ornately carved doors. In 1904, a simple maintenance check would lead to a number of discoveries that would change how people thought about the inn's history forever. What the authorities found behind the carefully papered walls and under the fancy carpets would make them question every single guest who had checked in over the past 26 years. County records show that the investigation that followed was quietly finished in 1968 and sealed by federal order. The files were reportedly lost in an office fire that same year. But over the years, bits and pieces of the truth have come out, put together from letters from people, unofficial journals, and the rare slip of the tongue from people who were supposed to keep quiet. This is the written story of the Wynn Inn and the horrible secrets that are hidden inside its walls. The building was a huge Victorian-style structure with 3 floors, a wraparound porch, and 22 guest rooms. It looked like each room had been carefully decorated with antiques, but later research showed that the furniture was not randomly placed or designed. The inn was at a crossroads where the main stagecoach route from Richmond met the newer rail line that went to the coal mining areas to the west. This job kept a steady stream of travelers coming through, including business people, government officials, and sometimes families moving to the promising lands beyond the mountains. The Wynn family owned and ran it, and Thaddeus Wynn, the son of the original builder, inherited it from his father. People who knew Thaddeus said he was a careful man of average height, with a well-groomed beard and eyes that seemed to keep track of everything they saw. He was always polite, but guests often commented on how he would suddenly show up in unexpected places, like at the ends of hallways, in the dining room's shadows, or even standing still in the garden at strange hours, as if he were deep in thought. Because it was at the crossroads of several important trading routes through the mountains, the inn had a good reputation among business travelers. The prices were fair, the rooms were clean, and the dining room served food that was fine but not great. The way it worked on the outside didn't suggest anything other than the usual business of hospitality. The Wynn Inn stood out from other places in the area because it kept very detailed records. Thaddeus Wynn kept detailed records of every guest who stayed at the inn, their names, jobs, destinations, and even personal habits were all written down in neat, flowing script. Later, these ledgers would be very important for figuring out what really happened at the Wynn Inn. The amount of detail was way more than what was needed to run a simple country inn. There were notes about guests' sleeping habits, food preferences, and even bits of conversations that were overheard. On the 17th of April 1904, a plumber named James Harrington was called to the inn to fix a problem with low water pressure on the 3rd floor that wouldn't go away. Several guests had complained about the problem in the weeks leading up to this one, saying that the water would sometimes stop completely and then start up again with a lot of force a few minutes later. Harrington, who had worked on the inn's plumbing many times over the years, thought that one of the main pipes that ran through the walls between rooms 17 and 18 might be blocked. What he found in the crawlspace between these rooms would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Virginia's history. It was mostly kept out of the news and kept from the public. Harrington's grandson told a local historian in 1962 that the plumber didn't talk about what happened that day very often, but when he did so with a deep sense of unease that stayed with him until he died in 1931. In a written statement to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department, Harrington explains how he got into the tight space between the walls to check the pipes. He wrote, "The wallpaper had been taken off in one place, and there seemed to be writing on the plaster underneath. When I held my lantern closer, I could make out what looked like a list of dates and initials, along with other markings I couldn't understand. The writing wasn't all in one hand. It looked like it was done by a lot of different people, some of whom had neatly printed letters, and others who had scratched them quickly, as if they were very upset or had very little time. People might have thought that this was just the work of previous workers, but Harrington saw something else, a small metal box built into the wall. The box had been covered with plaster and then hidden behind the wallpaper, but the plaster had crumbled because of the water damage, which made it visible. It was locked up tight, but it looked like it had been made recently, not like something that had been left behind when the inn was built. Several hours later, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood opened the box and found a folded piece of paper with a detailed map of the inn, focusing on room 17. The diagram showed which parts of the floorboards were marked with red ink. The notes in the margins talked about observation points, auditory channels, and influence markers. At the time, these words didn't mean much to the sheriff, but as the investigation went on, they would take on a disturbing meaning. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood chose to look at the floorboards in question when he got there to look into the matter. This meant that George Porter, a traveling pharmaceutical salesman who lived in the room at the time, had to move out for a short time. He was very upset about the change, but he finally agreed to move to another room for the night. As part of the investigation, Porter would later be interviewed a lot, but federal officials kept some of his statements secret. They found a leather-bound journal belonging to Eleanor Wynn, Thaddeus's wife, who had reportedly died of tuberculosis 3 years earlier, in 1901. It was carefully wrapped in oilcloth and hidden under the marked floorboards. No one ever questioned the official cause of death because tuberculosis was common in the area, and Eleanor had been known to have a bad cough for years before she died. There was no doctor present when she died, and her body was quickly buried in the family plot behind the inn. Only Thaddeus and a few staff members were there. The public would never see all of the journal's contents, but Deputy Walter Collins, who gave his personal papers to the Virginia Historical Society in 1952, said that what they read that day led to an immediate and thorough search of the entire building. Collins wrote to his brother, "I have never seen the sheriff so upset about anything in all my years of service. He told everyone at the inn to leave right away and find a place to stay in town." When asked about this strange behavior, he would only say that it was for the safety of the public and that more information would be given when it was needed. The Wynn Inn search would go on for 17 days. Thaddeus Wynn was nowhere to be found during this time. He had left for a business trip to Richmond the day before the plumber found him. A telegraph was sent, but Wynn never got to where he said he would. His disappearance added to the mystery, and some people thought he might have been warned about the investigation by someone in the local government or the inn staff who was working with him. There were a lot of interviews with the staff themselves. There were 8 people working at the inn: a cook, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, a stable hand, a handyman, a clerk, and a porter. Everyone said they didn't know much about any strange things that happened at the business, but some did say that some parts of their jobs were strange. Margaret Wilson, the cook, said that Thaddeus Wynn had certain rules about what meals should be served to guests in certain rooms. These rules sometimes required unusual ingredients or ways of making the food that she couldn't figure out. Sarah Jenkins, one of the maids, said that Thaddeus had told her never to clean room 17 unless he told her to do so, and even then, only with his direct supervision. Robert Taylor, the handyman, said he had made a number of changes to the rooms over the years, but he said he had only done so because Wynn had given him detailed instructions and he hadn't questioned why they were needed. As the investigators carefully searched the inn, they found that almost every room had hidden compartments, secret panels, or strange changes. The floorboard in room 8 was made so that it could be taken out and put back in without leaving any signs of disturbance. Underneath, there seemed to be sound equipment, like early listening devices that were connected to small tubes that ran through the walls. The back of the wardrobe in room 14 opened up to a hidden observation space that was just big enough for a person to stand in the dark and watch the room's occupant through tiny holes drilled into the ornate carvings on the wardrobe. There were a lot of speaking tubes in room 22 that let people on the first floor hear conversations from the owner's office. The decorative elements in the room cleverly hid these tubes. They were behind a painting, inside a bedpost, and under the writing desk. The amount of engineering skill needed for these changes suggested that they would cost a lot of money and require a lot more knowledge than what you would expect from a country innkeeper. But room 17 had the most scary things in it. At first glance, the room looked normal. A comfortable bed with a carved headboard, a writing desk by the window, a wardrobe against one wall, and a washstand with a porcelain basin. Upon closer inspection, however, it became clear that every part of the room had been carefully planned to subtly affect the people who lived there. The floorboards were spaced out in a way that made the floor feel a little uneven, which made people feel a little off balance all the time. The angle of the writing desk made it uncomfortable for anyone sitting at it, which would cause physical tension over time. The glass in the window had been slightly warped, which changed the quality of the light coming into the room in ways that would slowly change how people felt and saw things. Investigators found a secret compartment behind the bed's headboard that held personal items that seemed to belong to at least 7 different people. Some of these things were pocket watches, wedding rings, letters, and ID cards. None of these people had ever been reported missing, but the inn's records show that each of them stayed in room 17 at some point between 1892 and 1903. The ledger entries for these guests had strange notes, like subject responsive to auditory stimuli during delta phase, subject exhibits heightened suggestibility following method C application, and subject integration nearly complete, ready for final phase. The most confusing thing they found was a bunch of leather-bound books in a locked chest in Thaddeus Wynn's private office. These books had detailed information about guests, including their names, jobs, and personal lives, habits, and personalities. The information was much more detailed than what you could get in a short stay at an inn. Guests wrote about their childhoods, private fears, goals, and relationships that they probably wouldn't have talked about while they were there. It was even more disturbing that many entries had information about guests before they even got to the inn, which made it seem like there was a network of surveillance that went far beyond the inn itself. Records from the investigation show that Thaddeus Wynn had been in touch with innkeepers and hotel owners all along the eastern seaboard. This made it look like he had a large network for sharing information about travelers. Letters found in his office talked about a mutual endeavor and shared observations, which suggested that dozens of businesses were working together. Investigators thought that this network let Wynn know exactly who would be coming to his business and how much they might be worth. But it was still not clear what the value was for. There were no bodies found on the property, and no guests were ever confirmed to have been harmed at the Wynn. But the evidence pointed to a long-running, organized system of surveillance and possible exploitation. The case was even more confusing because there was no clear physical harm done to the guests. What did Thaddeus Wynn hope to gain from his complicated system of watching and controlling people? Authorities found a hidden room in the inn's basement that could only be reached through a narrow passage behind the coal chute. This changed the course of the investigation. There was a desk, a chair, and filing cabinets on the walls of the room. There were hundreds of folders in these cabinets, each with the name of a guest and the date of their stay on it. The folders had detailed notes about what was going on, and they often had small items in them, like a strand of hair, nail clippings, or torn pieces of clothing. These were things that could have been picked up during normal cleaning of the rooms, but were kept as specimens instead. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, a doctor from Roanoke who helped with the investigation, wrote in his private journal that the contents of these folders showed an unprecedented level of psychological manipulation. The careful observations of behavior, the gathering of personal information without permission, and the strategic placement of certain objects in rooms to get certain emotional responses all point to a methodical study of human psychology for purposes I dare not speculate played upon in writing. Whitaker was especially upset by a series of notebooks that seemed to outline experimental protocols. He wrote, "These describe systematic methods for inducing specific emotional and psychological states in subjects without their awareness. Methods for messing with sleep patterns, causing mild disorientation, and making people more open to suggestion by changing their surroundings. The most disturbing part is the clinical tone. These weren't the actions of a madman. They were the planned actions of someone doing what they clearly thought was legitimate scientific research." On the 11th of May 1904, the investigation came to an end when federal officials showed up and took all the evidence from the inn. There are only a few records that say the case was a matter of national security, but no one ever explained why it was classified this way. Local police were told to stop all investigations, and anyone who had been involved in the investigation had to sign confidentiality agreements or face prosecution. A notice of condemnation was put up on the Wynn Inn's boarded-up windows. In less than 6 months, a fire destroyed the building, and local firefighters were told not to fight it. The official report said that bad wiring was to blame, even though the building didn't have electricity yet. Many people later pointed to this clear contradiction in official records as proof of a planned cover-up. For years, the story of the Wynn Inn faded from people's minds, and the only people who talked about it were the oldest residents of Blacksburg. The land where the inn used to be stayed empty because locals said the ground had been ruined by what happened there. People who were passing through the area would sometimes ask about places to stay near the crossroads, but they would be sent to places much farther away without any explanation. In 1938, Margaret Holbrook, a graduate student at the University of Virginia, became interested in the story while looking into the history of hospitality in the Blue Ridge area. Local officials and residents were unusually unhelpful when she asked them questions. She wrote in her research notes, "No one wants to talk about the old Wynn place. When I bring it up, conversations stop and people find reasons to leave." One older woman crossed herself and refused to talk to me anymore, and a local businessman who had seemed helpful at first suddenly said he didn't know anything about the place, even though he had just mentioned it by name a few minutes earlier. Holbrook didn't give up and kept going through official channels, asking different government agencies for information about the story. Most of these requests were turned down, but in 1941, the Department of the Interior sent her a partial answer that included several pages of redacted documents about the Wynn Inn investigation. These heavily edited documents didn't give much concrete information, but they did show that the federal government had been involved in the case and was still interested in keeping the details secret almost 40 years later. One of these papers was a memo from an unnamed federal agent to his boss, dated the 3rd of June, 1904. The memo said, "The methods used at the Wynn establishment are a step forward in behavioral study that, while morally wrong, may be useful for our ongoing work. I recommend that all information be kept secret and that relevant materials be obtained for further analysis." The rest of the document had been blacked out, and there was no indication of which government department had written it or what ongoing work might have benefited from Wynn's methods. World War II got in the way of Holbrook's research, and she never went back to it. The university archives held her notes and the papers she had collected, but they were mostly forgotten until 1967, when Professor James Thornton found them while looking for information for a book about strange criminal cases in Virginia's history. Thornton was a criminologist who was interested in the psychological aspects of criminal behavior. He saw the Wynn Inn case as an early example of systematic psychological manipulation that could be very important. Thornton was interested in the Wynn Inn case, so he found Walter Collins, the former deputy who had been part of the original investigation. By then, Collins was an old man living in a nursing home in Lynchburg. At first, Collins didn't want to talk about the case. He is said to have told Thornton during their first meeting, "Some things are best left buried, not because they're dead, but because they're still alive in ways you wouldn't understand." The Wynn business didn't end when the inn burned down. It just went deeper underground. Collins, on the other hand, started to talk about what he had seen in 1904 after a few visits. Thornton's notes say that Collins told him that the investigation had found evidence that Thaddeus Wynn was doing some kind of psychological testing on his guests to see how small changes in the environment could affect their behavior and emotions. Collins is quoted as saying each room was made to get certain responses. The placement of the furniture, the colors of the walls, and even the spacing of the floorboards were all planned out. Wynn would make small changes between guest stays and keep track of how they acted differently. Some rooms were meant to make people sad, while others were meant to make them angry or scared. Room 17 was set aside for what Wynn called the culmination, but we never found out what that meant. Collins talked about how guests who stayed in certain rooms would have strange dreams or mood swings that didn't make sense. He said, "A businessman who was known for being calm got mad for no reason during his 3-night stay in room 9. A woman who had never shown any signs of being nervous became paralyzed with anxiety after spending just bend." one night in room 14. These effects sometimes lasted long after the guests had left, as we found out when we tried to contact previous guests during our investigation. Collins also said that Eleanor Wynn's journal had disturbing stories about how her husband slowly changed from a curious observer of people to an obsessive manipulator. She wrote about how he would stay up all night listening to guests talk through the speaking tubes, hearing their private moments of sadness or happiness. Collins said he seemed especially interested in dreams. He had come up with ways to change what people dreamed about while they were staying at the inn. Collins says that Eleanor first supported her husband's interest in human behavior and even helped him with his early observations. But as his methods became more intrusive and manipulative, she started to worry. Her diary entries from the year before she died talked about how she was becoming more scared of her husband and how she thought she might have become one of his subjects. In one entry that Collins remembered, she wrote, "I find my thoughts going in directions that don't feel like my own. Does the tea he makes me every night have more than the herbal medicine he says it does?" Collins's most troubling discovery was the network of innkeepers that Wynn wrote to. Collins says that the investigation found proof that this network went beyond just sharing information. He said these weren't just innkeepers. Doctors, lawyers, and government officials were all involved. They called themselves the Observatory. They thought they were making a science of human behavior that they could use to control people. The Observatory, as described in the letters, saw their work as groundbreaking research that would one day let them systematically change people's behavior on a large scale. They shared methods, results, and subjects, and they sent some travelers to each other's places to keep an eye on things and try new things. In their letters, they talked about a graduated protocol that would start with small changes to the environment and move on to more direct changes to the subject's mental state. Thornton's research into the Wynn case ended just as suddenly as the first one. In January 1968, while driving to an interview with another possible witness, his car went off the road close to the old property. They found his body, but they never found his research materials. The official report said that the person died of a heart attack while driving, which led to the crash. Even though Thornton's co-workers at the university asked for one, no autopsy was done. They said that he had no history of heart problems and had passed a physical exam just 2 months before. A small fire in the Montgomery County Records Office that same year destroyed many files, including all the paperwork that was still available for the Wynn investigation. Someone broke into the university archives where Margaret Holbrook's things were kept, and her collection was one of the only things that were stolen. 1 week after his last meeting with Thornton, Walter Collins died in his sleep. He had not written down anything about his experiences other than what Thornton had already written down. The story might have ended there, lost to time and intentional erasure, if not for a discovery made in 1965 when a new highway was being built through the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 20 miles from the old Wynn site. This chronological break in the story shows information that came to light only after Thornton started his research. This made him even more determined to find out the whole story, even though he was facing more and more resistance. Workers digging up the hillside for the roadbed found a small cave entrance that had been blocked off with stones. They found a leather trunk inside that had Thaddeus Wynn's papers, books, and other personal items. One of these things was a journal that gave a clinical account of what he called the Grand Experiment. It looks like the journal was hidden after he went missing in 1904. Maybe with the idea of getting it back later, but that never happened. According to a few reports from workers who saw the contents before they were taken by the police, Wynn's writings showed that the inn was built from the ground up to be a lab for studying how people act in controlled situations. Each room was set up to test a different hypothesis about how people would react emotionally and mentally. The journal had architectural drawings that showed how the building had changed over time, with new parts added as Wynn got better at his craft. Wynn's notes about graduated exposure were even more troubling. This was a method he would use to gradually increase the intensity of the psychological stimuli used on returning guests and keep track of how their responses changed over time. Researchers really liked studying people who traveled back and forth between places because they could see how well different methods worked over time. It appeared that guests who had stayed multiple times would eventually be put in room 17, where they would be subjected to the full extent of Wynn's manipulations. According to bits of information that came from people who had seen the journal, Wynn tried to achieve what he called complete environmental control in this room. This meant that he could control every aspect of a person's experience, from their sensory input to their emotional response, without them knowing or agreeing to it. It was not clear what specific methods were used, but the workers who found the trunk said that there were diagrams of the room that showed complicated changes to the lighting, airflow, sound transmission, and even the chemical makeup of the materials used in the furniture. It's not clear what happened to the people who stayed in room 17. There was never any solid proof of murder, but the personal items found behind the headboard suggest that at least some people never left the inn. If they did, they left without their most valuable and personal items. Wynn's journal supposedly had entries about terminal subjects who had finished the protocol, but it was impossible to tell if this meant death, some kind of mental breakdown, or something else entirely from the bits of information that got out, despite the government's best efforts to keep them secret. Federal agents quickly took the things they found in the cave, and the cave itself was sealed off and its location hidden by the ongoing construction on the highway. The workers who found it had to sign agreements not to tell anyone about it, but rumors about what they found spread through local communities for years after that. In 1967, a worker who didn't want to be named told a local newspaper reporter that the agents who took the materials were not from any agency he knew of. He said, "Not the FBI, not the local police. These men didn't say who they were. They just showed the foreman some kind of proof that made him back off and let them take everything without a fight." One rumor that kept coming up was about a map found in Wynn's things. It was said to show where other inns in the observatory network were located around the country. If there was such a map, it has never been made public. This leaves open the possibility that the Wynn was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger operation. When you think about the fact that the federal government is clearly trying to hide information about the case and possibly keep Wynn's research methods for their own use, this possibility becomes even more disturbing. A former guest of the Wynn came forward in 1969 with a story about his stay there in 1902. Harold Simmons, who was a traveling salesman at the time, remembered his 3-night stay in room 12 very clearly. In a recorded interview with local historian Evelyn Porter, he said, "I've never slept so badly in my life. Every night, I had the most vivid nightmares. They weren't the usual silly dreams. They were methodical scenarios of being watched, studied, and having my most private thoughts laid bare." Simmons talked about how some things in the room seemed to change between when he left in the morning and came back in the evening. The wardrobe was maybe an inch closer to the bed. The window shade was set at a slightly different height. These were small things that made me question my own perception. At first, I thought maybe the maid had moved things around while cleaning, but when I casually mentioned it to Mr. Wynn, he assured me that staff had been told never to rearrange guests' rooms. His answer was oddly detailed for such a simple question, as if he had prepared it in advance. The salesman also heard strange noises coming from inside the walls. These weren't the usual settling noises of an old building. They were rhythmic tapping that started at midnight and went on until about 2:17 every morning. He said, "I set my pocket watch to it. The regularity was what bothered me the most. Nature isn't that precise, so it had to be human. Someone, or something, was making those sounds on purpose, but I couldn't figure out why." Simmons woke up on his last night there to find Thaddeus Wynn sitting in the corner of his room, just watching him. When I asked what he was doing, he apologized profusely, saying that he had mixed up the rooms while checking on another guest who had asked for a late-night remedy for indigestion. But his eyes, they held no embarrassment or surprise at being discovered. They were calculating, as if my reaction was exactly what he had come to observe. Simmons checked out the next morning and didn't return to the area for decades, until he heard about Professor Thornton's research through an old colleague. His story is one of the few first-hand accounts of Wynn's methods from someone who understood, at least in part, what was going on. It seems that most guests either didn't notice anything strange or thought that any strange things that happened were just normal travel problems or their own tired minds. Emily Patterson, who worked as a maid at the inn for a short time in 1899, also gave an account. Patterson wrote a letter to her sister that was found among family papers in 1966. In it, She talked about how Thaddeus Wynn would interview potential employees in great detail before hiring them, asking them about their sleep habits, their ability to keep secrets, and whether they were troubled by dreams. "He looked almost sad when I told him I don't remember my dreams very often," she wrote. "It felt like he was looking for something in me that I didn't have." Patterson's letter talked about how she was becoming more and more unhappy with some parts of her job. She wrote, "Mr. Wynn has very clear instructions for how rooms should be set up. The angle of the mirrors, the placement of the lamps, and even how the bed sheets should be folded. All must be done exactly as he says. When I suggested a better way to turn down the beds, he got very angry and said that any deviation from his instructions would contaminate the environment. It was an odd choice of words, more like what a doctor might say about a surgical room than an innkeeper about guest accommodations." Wynn told Patterson to clean room 17 after he had worked there for 3 weeks. Her letter said, "He stood in the doorway, watching everything I did. The room itself seemed normal enough, but the air was heavy, which made it hard to breathe comfortably. While I was dusting the writing desk, I saw small holes drilled into the bottom that were too neat to be wormholes and too deliberate to be flaws in the wood. When I bent down to look at them more closely, Mr. Wynn quickly told me to look somewhere else and told me to clean the mirror exactly how he wanted it done." The next day, Patterson quit her job, saying she had a family emergency. She said in her letter that this was a lie. "I couldn't stand being there another day. There's something wrong there that I can't put into words but can feel in my bones. Mr. Wynn watches us all, not just the guests, but the staff too. I feel like we're all part of an experiment whose purpose I don't want to think about." In 1968, an anonymous donor gave the Virginia Historical Society a collection of letters that were supposedly written by members of the observatory between 1890 and 1903. This was the most recent development in the Wynn case. It has never been proven that these letters are real, but they talk about psychological experiments that were done in different places across the country, with the Wynn often being used as an example. Because this donation happened at the same time as Professor Thornton's research and death, some people think that the letters may have come from someone who knew about the original investigation and wanted to make sure that some record of the observatory survived the apparent efforts to erase it from history. These letters describe a way of thinking that saw traditional morality as a barrier to scientific progress. To truly understand the human mind, one letter says, we must be willing to observe it under conditions of extreme duress, in moments of profound emotional and psychological disturbance. Only then can we map the true boundaries of consciousness and perhaps extend beyond them. The writer goes on to say that getting consent from subjects would make the results invalid because knowing they were being watched would change their behavior in ways that would make the data useless. The letters talk about different places in the eastern United States that had been changed to be used as observation posts. These places included hotels, inns, and boarding houses where travelers could be watched without their knowledge. It seems that these places were chosen because they were isolated. Their customers were only there for a short time, and it was easy to change them to include observation spaces and environmental controls. The Wynn was called the most advanced of our facilities, capable of environmental modulations of unprecedented subtlety. The letters also talk about a culmination that was supposed to happen at the Wynn in the fall of 1904. This event was called the final synthesis of our collective work, the demonstration that will validate our methods and secure our legacy. What this culmination might have involved is still a mystery, since the discovery of the hidden writings in April of that year seems to have messed up whatever had been planned. One letter from March 1904 talks about getting ready for the delegation and how people at different stages of the protocol need to be there to be watched. The references to permanent acquisitions are probably the most disturbing. These are people who were chosen for long-term study because they were very responsive to the methods used. It seems that these people were moved between different facilities in the network, and their disappearances were explained in ways that would stop people from asking questions, such as changing jobs, making up family emergencies, or getting too good to refuse offers in faraway places. It's not clear from the bits of letters we have whether these acquisitions were kept under some kind of psychological control or physical confinement. The land where the Wynn Inn used to be is still undeveloped today. It is a grassy field with trees on the edges that have grown back. There is no sign at the site that tells people how important it is, and most people who live nearby don't know its history. The road that used to lead people to its doors has been moved, and the crossroads it used to serve now has a modern gas station and convenience store. There isn't much to see at the site, but historians or curious locals do visit from time to time. No foundation is still visible, and no artifacts have been found after years of natural erosion. However, a portion of Wynn's legacy endures in the academic literature of psychology and behavioral science. Some methods for examining the impact of environmental factors on emotional states exhibit significant similarities to Wynn's techniques, albeit without proper attribution. People who read Wynn's work say that ideas that show up in it later showed up in mainstream psychological theory, but as new discoveries instead of the continuation of a darker lineage. In the middle of the 20th century, scientists started using terms like environmental priming, unconscious behavioral modification, and context-dependent emotional response to talk about things that Thaddeus Wynn had been studying in a systematic way at the turn of the century. The historical interval between Wynn's contributions and the introduction of these concepts in academic literature corresponds with phases of government-sponsored research into psychological manipulation, encompassing initiatives that were subsequently partially declassified and recognized as involving unethical experimentation on unsuspecting individuals. It cannot be definitively determined whether these programs had access to Wynn's research methods. However, the similarities are challenging to regard as mere coincidence. One must contemplate the number of similar institutions that were part of the observatory network and whether their impact continues to influence our comprehension of the human mind in unrecognized ways. Even more disturbing is the question of how many guests checked into rooms that were meant to change their most private thoughts and feelings without knowing they were part of an experiment with no clear goal or design. And maybe the most disturbing thing of all is that the methods that were first used in these places may not have died with their creators. Instead, they may have been kept, improved, and used in places far away from a remote inn in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We may never know the whole truth about the Wynn. The intentional destruction of records, the seizure of evidence by federal authorities, and the deaths of eyewitnesses have made much of its history uncertain. It is certain that a man named Thaddeus Wynn conducted a systematic study of human psychology within those walls, using methods that went against all the rules of ethical research and maybe even basic human decency. We can't fully measure how much damage was done to the people who stayed at the inn, but the bits of evidence that have survived suggest that at least some guests left with psychological scars that never healed. Their perceptions, emotions, and behaviors changed in ways that lasted long after they went back to their normal lives. William Garrett's family gave a revealing account of their time at the Wynn Inn in October 1899. He was a lumber merchant who stayed there for 3 nights. Sarah, his wife, wrote to her sister that Garrett came back from his business trip changed in ways that were hard for her to put into words. She wrote, "It seems like a shadow has fallen over his mind. He jumps at little noises, stares at blank walls for hours, and sometimes talks to empty corners of rooms as if he were talking to someone only he can see." Over the next few months, Garrett's health got worse. He gave up his once successful business, cut himself off from friends and family, and was eventually sent to Western State Hospital in Staunton, where he stayed until he died in 1912. A researcher looked at his medical records in 1963 and saw that he kept saying he was still in the room and under observation. The doctor who treated him thought these delusions were due to general paranoia, not knowing that they might be linked to Garrett's stay at the Wynn Inn years before. When Professor Thornton started looking for former guests as part of his research, he found other cases that were similar. Those he was able to find often had strange psychological patterns, like having nightmares all the time, having fears that didn't make sense, or changing their behavior soon after leaving the inn. Many people said they still felt like they were being watched years later, and some said they had dreams about going back to a room they couldn't quite place, but that made them feel very scared. The most disturbing thing about the Wynn Inn case is not what we know, but what we don't know. the contents of Room 17, the nature of the culmination, the extent of the observatory network, and the possibility that government agencies that saw value in Wynn's morally wrong work could use his methods. Someone probably knew how powerful these techniques could be and tried to keep people from using them instead of exposing and condemning them as the wrongs they were. Several researchers who tried to look into the case in the years after it was first found ran into the same kinds of problems. Files would go missing right before their scheduled visits to archives. People who had agreed to interviews would suddenly stop all contact, and photographs of the inn would disappear from collections where they had been reliably cataloged for years. You could write these things off as coincidences or just the normal problems that come up when doing historical research, but they keep happening in this case, and they happen more often than usual. In 1959, journalist Marion Hayes tried to write an article about the Wynn for a national magazine. She wrote about her experience in a private letter to a coworker. She wrote, "It's like the story doesn't want to be told. Every lead disappears when I look into it. People who should know something say they don't or refuse to talk. Documents that should exist have disappeared. In all my years of investigative reporting, I've never seen such organized resistance. It feels like I'm being watched as I do my investigation, and my plans are being anticipated and countered before I even make them." In 1968, just days before his fatal accident, Professor Thornton wrote in his notes, "I cannot escape the feeling that the Wynn Inn was merely the visible portion of something far larger and more pervasive. The deeper I dig, the more I sense that I am not discovering a forgotten history, but intruding upon an ongoing operation that never truly ended with the closing of the inn. The techniques have evolved. The locations have changed. But the fundamental approach remains. The systematic observation and manipulation of human behavior without consent, conducted under the guise of ordinary environments that conceal their true purpose." When you think about this observation in light of some government programs that were later found to have done psychological experiments in the middle of the 20th century, it becomes even more important. The timing of federal intervention in the Wynn Inn case and the specific interest in preserving rather than exposing its methods raises troubling questions about the potential adaptation of those methods for purposes beyond Thaddeus. Wynn's original grand experiment. A heavily redacted document obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1976 mentions a historical acquisition of behavioral modification techniques from a private research initiative circa 1904. That served as the basis for later protocol development. The document goes on to say that these methods were especially useful because they focused on the environment instead of chemicals, which made them useful in places where they weren't controlled and had a low risk of being found out. Even though this document doesn't say Wynn or Thaddeus Wynn by name, the date and description match what is known about the case. Some parts of these programs have been made public, but others are still secret. They used psychological manipulation techniques that are very similar to those used in the Wynn's operation. If Wynn's methods were actually kept and improved by government agencies, the effects would be much bigger than just the historical interest of a strange inn in the Virginia mountains. The capacity to affect behavior and emotional states via environmental manipulation, honed over decades with federal funding, may constitute a form of power that functions beneath the level of conscious awareness existing yet unrecognized in diverse aspects of daily life. Architectural historians who have examined the scant descriptions of the Wynn's alterations have observed that specific characteristics began to emerge in institutional contexts in the decades subsequent to the inn's demolition. Nuanced design elements that influence movement patterns, emotional reactions, and cognitive processing, without the conscious awareness of individuals encountering them. These things can be seen in government buildings, transportation hubs, and other public places. They were probably put there for aesthetic or practical reasons, but they may also serve less obvious purposes. Dr. Elizabeth Mercer, an architectural psychologist who looked at the Wynn Inn in 1966, said, "The genius of Wynn's approach, if the accounts are accurate, was in making the manipulative elements of the environment appear entirely ordinary. A slight asymmetry in room proportions, a barely perceptible incline in the flooring, the positioning of light sources to create subtle visual distortions. None of these would be noticed consciously, yet each would contribute to a cumulative effect on the occupant's psychological state. These principles appear to have been incorporated into various institutional designs throughout the mid-20th century, particularly in settings where influencing behavior would be advantageous to authorities. If you're driving through the Blue Ridge Mountains and happen to be near Blacksburg, Virginia, you might see a turnoff from the highway that isn't marked. It's a narrow road that looks like it goes nowhere and ends in an empty field surrounded by old oaks. According to local legend, lights can be seen moving among the trees where the Wynn Inn used to be on some nights, especially in April. Some people say that these are just the flashlights of people who are curious and have heard vague rumors about how important the site is. Some people say something else entirely, that the inn and its purposes still exist in some way that can't be seen, and they keep an eye on those who come looking for its secrets. In 1971, a local person told a folklorist about their experience hiking near the old inn site, but they didn't give their name. I didn't mean to go there. I was just following a deer trail and didn't realize where I was until I got to the clearing. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. I felt watched, not in a make-believe way, but in the very real sense that I was being watched from many angles. The feeling was so strong that I called out, thinking maybe other hikers were nearby. There was no answer, but the feeling stayed with me. When I turned to leave, I saw that I had been standing in what must have been the exact center of the original structure. You can still see the foundation line if you know what to look for. I had the strangest thought then, that I had been standing in room 17, and that somehow it was still there. Not physically, but in some other way I can't quite explain. After all, Thaddeus Wynn allegedly wrote in his last journal entry, "The true power of our work lies not in the manipulations themselves, but in the permanence of their effect." Long after the subject has left our controlled environment, the changes we have initiated continue to develop like a photograph slowly emerging in chemical solution. In this way, the room extends beyond its physical boundaries, existing wherever the subject goes, continuing its work without our direct intervention. The ultimate achievement would be an environment that perpetuates itself through those who have experienced it, a self-propagating influence that transfers from one subject to another through ordinary human interaction. The Wynn Inn's most important legacy may not be what happened inside its walls, but what happened outside of them. Ideas and methods that spread outward, sneaking into real institutions and practices in ways that are too subtle to notice, but too deep to ignore. The inn itself may be gone, turned to ash, and then to memory, but the questions it raises about privacy, consent, and how easily the mind can be changed by outside forces are still important today, just like they were in 1904. Since the inn was destroyed, we have learned a lot more about environmental psychology. We now understand that our environment affects how we think, feel, and act in ways that we don't always notice. The lighting, sound, space, and many other aspects of our environment affect how we feel and what we do. This is something that is often used in business, schools, and even at home. The distinction between this legitimate field of study and Wynn's methods lies not in the fundamental principle that environments influence psychology, but in the issues of consent, transparency, and ethical intent. The Wynn Inn's innovative methods exemplified a nefarious utilization of this knowledge, employing environmental manipulation not to improve well-being or efficiency, but to impose control surreptitiously, to surveil without consent, and to modify psychological states for objectives known solely to the observer. The preservation and advancement of these techniques, rather than their exposure and condemnation, signifies a troubling chapter in the history of psychological research, one that continues to cast shadows into the present. Dr. Raymond Foster, a historian of psychology who has studied the limited available information about the Wynn Inn, said in a 2017 interview, "The disturbing aspect of this case is not merely what was done to those unfortunate guests, but the suggestion that someone, whether government agencies or private interests, saw value in these methods and chose to develop rather than disavow them. If this indeed occurred, it represents a critical but largely unexamined branch in the evolution of applied psychology, one that operates in the shadows of legitimate research and influences aspects of contemporary practice in ways we may not fully recognize." Some places change those who enter them in ways that can never be undone, Deputy Collins told Professor Thornton during their last meeting. I believe the Wynn Inn was one of those places, not because of any supernatural quality, but because it was designed with exacting precision to alter the human mind. And the most frightening thought of all is that we may never know how many were changed, or in what ways, or to what end. Different reports from the small number of people who have looked into the Wynn case point to a pattern of psychological problems that go beyond what would be expected from looking into a disturbing event in history. As her research went on, Marion Hayes said she was becoming more paranoid and couldn't sleep. Eventually, she gave up on writing her article altogether. In the weeks leading up to his death, Professor Thornton's coworkers noticed that he was becoming more agitated and secretive, which was not like him. Even though Margaret Holbrook wasn't very interested in the case, she asked to change her thesis topic soon after getting the redacted government documents. She said she was having nightmares and couldn't concentrate as her reasons. It would be easy to write off these experiences as normal psychological effects of dealing with disturbing material, but the symptoms are consistent and specific. Multiple researchers documented a similar anomalous sensation: the perception that the confines of the room they inhabited had become permeable, resulting in a simultaneous experience of being in their own space and an indistinct alternate location. This particular phenomenological experience, reported independently by individuals lacking any contact with one another and, in certain instances, separated by decades, indicates a pattern that surpasses mere coincidence. When night falls over the Blue Ridge Mountains, the empty field where the inn used to be is quiet and looks like nothing special. But for those who know the history, the lack of presence speaks as loudly as any presence. A deliberate erasure that raises more questions than it answers about what really happened at the Wynn Inn and whether any room ever really gave up all its secrets. The Wynn Inn case is still one of the strangest and most disturbing events in the history of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It showed how people violated basic rights and freedoms while pretending to be doing scientific research without any moral limits. We may never know the full extent of its effect on people who didn't know they were being studied and on future developments in behavioral research. For at least 20 years, travelers who just wanted to spend the night at a remote mountain inn unknowingly took part in experiments that were meant to map and change the limits of human consciousness. They checked into rooms that had been carefully planned to change their thoughts, feelings, and perceptions in ways that they couldn't see or stop. Some of these people may have left with small but lasting changes to how their minds worked, changes that followed them home like shadows and stayed with them long after they had forgotten the name and location of the place where the cruise process started. And maybe the most disturbing thing of all is that the methods that were used at the Wynn Inn didn't stop when it was destroyed. Instead, they were improved and used in situations we come across every day. Situations that change how we feel and act in ways we don't even notice, for reasons we can't understand, by people or groups whose motives are just as mysterious as Thaddeus Wynn's. The true horror of the Wynn Inn was not that it was an anomaly, a single disturbed individual conducting isolated experiments, but that it epitomized the visible aspect of a more extensive system, a network of surveillance and manipulation that acknowledged the susceptibility of the human mind to environmental influence and exploited that susceptibility without consideration for consent or consequence. If a system like this existed once, in the form of a remote country inn at the turn of the century, one must wonder what it might look like today, hidden in plain sight among the normal buildings of modern life. If you're ever in an unfamiliar room, like a hotel room on a business trip or a room at a relative's house, take a moment to look around. Pay attention to where the furniture is, how bright the light is, and the quiet sounds that fill the room. Think about how these things make you feel and how they might be changing your thoughts and feelings in ways that aren't obvious right away. And maybe, just maybe, think about the people who checked into room 17 at the Wynn Inn and had no idea that the room they were in was designed to mess with their minds. It was a room that, in some way, they might never really leave,